And it is the final election day in the United States. So much is happening in this action-packed presidential race. In fact, we're getting some live shots of the Vice President, Kamala Harris. Let's go across to it.
Thank you so very much. You know, it's so important that everybody participates, and I thank you because I'm sure you got a lot of other things you could be doing, but taking the time to vote really does matter. So thank you for that. And you enjoy your day, okay?
Madam President!
All right, this is a real phone bank. Get back to making calls. Please, please, please. We got voters to still get out.
Jennifer and Kamala Harris, how are you? I am well. I just wanted to call to check in and make sure you know where you can go vote today if you haven't already. Have you voted yet? Oh, thank you.
All right, those are some live shots coming in from Washington, D.C. Probably inside the Howard University, which is where the Vice President and also the Democratic presidential nominee, Kamala Harris, was expected to be at the election day. And she seems to be crowded with her supporters as well as her campaign team as the race closes in.
I can't wait for you to grow 10 years more. Oh, you know what? IEPs are so important. We have so much work to do to just keep reinforcing the Department of Education and getting all the resources there. And Sage, I can tell you're really smart and you're working really hard. You are still a leader at every age that you are. 8 years old, that's a serious leadership.
All right, let's go across to our correspondent Susan Tehran, who is joining us live from New York. Susan, we are getting some live shots from Washington, D.C., where we can see the Democratic presidential nominee, Kamala Harris, along with her supporters and campaign team. What's happening at this point?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I'm looking at those shots as well, and it appears that, it's customary, as Donald Trump did in the morning, to go cast their ballots, talk to their supporters, and, say that, we're looking forward for a long night, but we're going to be successful. Both candidates are saying this. I'm standing, of course, in front of a polling station here in New York City right now. It's starting to get crowded again. It was pretty crowded in the morning before work. There was a long line, and now it's around 3, 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and people are continuing to vote. I think it's really interesting. I haven't seen early voting like this, of course, in a very long time, although 2020 really did break a record because of COVID. But also on voting day, I'm seeing that a lot of people are going to vote as well. It just shows how important this election is for people and how much they feel that they have at stake electing the candidate of their choice.
Absolutely, and as you mentioned, this is an extremely close election that we are witnessing in the United States. And also, Susan, earlier we were getting a few reports of some mismanagement and also technical issues in Queen. Are you hearing anything on that front?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. At first, it started with reports in Brooklyn where there was a local news stationed outside of one of the polling stations just by chance, and the people started coming out very angry. There was some issues with voting machines. And then in Queens, the congresswoman for that district put out a video on social media saying that because of the thickness of the papers, some of them had to process their vote up to 20 times until it was finally registered. And she was encouraging people and, her supporters, she was from the Republican Party, to stay in line, stay the course, don't give up, make sure that your vote is registered because that's the only way that it'll be counted. And then, of course, earlier we also heard about issues with the voting machines and then not enough volunteer workers, poll workers in many of the districts in Pennsylvania as well, and one in Georgia, I believe. So, yeah, these issues are widespread and we learn more and more about them just because of the power of social media and how the media works right now.
Right, that's one thing, but there are also security concerns. We're hearing non-credible bomb threats in Georgia. In fact, a man has been arrested in Michigan who was threatening to attack Donald Trump. In fact, prosecutors are saying that the man sent a threat directly to the FBI, saying, and I'm quoting, "I shall carry out an attack against conservative Christian filth in the event Trump wins the election." Are these kinds of threats usual in American election cycle?
None of this is normal, for sure. But the issue is, because the rhetoric is so high against, one candidate against the other, these rhetorics are really ultimately causing a lot of people that aren't normal, that are obviously crazy, to act up on a lot of things that the campaigns have said. I mean, it's just been campaigns of name calling on both sides, and it's no surprise that things like this happen. And then again, I want to talk about the issue of the social media and the power of social media, how fast things get accelerated, generated, sometimes misinformation comes into it, and then you have to be very careful. I do want to say that in terms of numbers, there was a report on Newswires that more than 40% of poll workers have faced some sort of harassment one way or the other, whether in 2020 or even now during early voting. They face threats, they face harassment, and sometimes even like threats against their lives as well. So yeah, none of this is normal, but it just shows what a hyped up, polarized society we have in the United States, and also how heated things can get so fast.
Absolutely, Susan. Please stay with me. We are also being joined by Robert Shapiro from New York City. He is a professor of political science and in the School of International and Public Affairs at Columbia University. Professor, thank you so much for joining us here on WION. I and my correspondent Susan, we were just discussing about how close this election is and how polarized the American society has become. Your thoughts?
Well, the polarization of American society began to increase in the 1970s going forward, when the political parties became much more ideologically distinctive and closely competitive for the presidency, and also, the new thing, competitive for control of Congress, the House of Representatives, and the Senate. So at the same time, the parties were very different from each other on a wide range of issues, very competitive, and then that increased the emotional level of politics, and add to the mix the nature of Donald Trump's personality and his almost advocacy of violence that really has heightened the level of tension in the United States overall. And we see it now with regard to the tension in the current elections. So far, the election has been quite peaceful and administered well. Some of the glitches you've talked about have been normal. So it's so far so good, but the day isn't over yet.
Right. Professor Shapiro, a quick question, since you also mentioned Donald Trump. On the other side, the blue camp, a lot of Democrats have been, in fact, very critical of the way some of the wordings have played out over the course of the campaign. It's unheard of, a Democratic nominee calling their rival a fascist. Your thoughts?
I agree. Donald Trump has changed the norms of political rhetoric in a stunning way, and increasingly so in this election. We saw how this played out at his Madison Square Garden rally, when the comedian there basically insulted Puerto Ricans in Puerto Rico in the United States.
All right, Susan, if I could quickly come back to you. Back in 2020, Joe Biden managed to rebuild the blue wall by flipping all three states of Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan. But Biden is also from Scranton, and we need to take care of that. On top of that, Harris seems to be losing male voters. Do you think she'll be able to guard the blue wall?
Yeah, the million-dollar question, really. We'll have to wait and see. I mean, there are reports coming in from both camps that they're doing pretty well in those states. I did hear one pollster mention that for Kamala Harris to win Pennsylvania, she would need around 600,000 votes in that state. How much early voting has been successful in these sort of blue wall states, as you mentioned, is going to be detrimental. But also, half of the population that's eligible to vote will be voting on election day as well. So it's anyone's game. It'll also be interesting to see. In 2016, Donald Trump was able to get Pennsylvania, and then, of course, as you mentioned, Joe Biden in 2020 got all of those states. It'll be interesting to see I'm interested to see women versus men in these battleground states or those blue wall states. You know, how many women will go out for Kamala Harris? How many men will go out for Donald Trump? Because we're seeing a huge gender gap right now in the polls. I'm interested to see whether or not, the polls will be accurate.
Absolutely. And taking that point further, Professor Shapiro, if you could talk about the swing states a little. You're someone, of course, who is studying it closely. And in any election, the swing states are very crucial, but especially in this one. In fact, I did a little bit of mental math. And back in 2020's U.S. presidential elections, if we closely look at Georgia, Arizona, and Wisconsin, it's roughly 20,000 people, just 20,000 people, who, if they would have voted for Donald Trump would have been the 46th president of the United States and not Joe Biden. And then I further calculated that 0.008% of the population of United States. So that figure tells us that 0.0008% of the population can actually decide who the president is.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. That is a it's a striking percentage, but the number of votes is striking as well. Actually, the correct number is a little over 40,000 votes in those three states. And in 2016, Trump won the presidency by just 70,000 votes in three states. Now, the thing that was very striking in 2016 that people forget is that Trump got the blue wall, but he only needed one of the three states. He only needed Wisconsin, Michigan, or Pennsylvania, and he got all three. And the same thing applies here if he holds on to Georgia, North Carolina, and Arizona. And so really, it is an extraordinarily close election, as you have pointed out.
Right. Professor Shapiro, I also want to talk to you about the undecided voters. But if I could quickly go back to Susan and ask, Susan, have you managed to speak to any of these undecided voters who are still undecided on election day? What are their concerns?
The undecided voters that I talk to, of course, not here in Upper Manhattan. People usually know who they're voting for pretty early on. But the ones that I spoke to, they are younger, and they were concerned that neither candidate really addresses the issues that they're concerned about. The war in Gaza is one of the outliers, really, in this year's election, that foreign policy just plays such an important role. And then you have the issue of housing for a lot of young voters, and then the issue of climate change as well. You know, we haven't really heard a lot of that. And those are issues that when I talk to younger voters, they tend to be undecided. They wanted to hear more from each candidate, notably Kamala Harris, on how she wants to address these issues.
Right. Professor Shapiro, now that the undecided voters are not going to hear from the candidates anymore, is there a chance that these undecided voters that range between 3 to 4% might not vote at all?
I'm not even sure that the percentage of undecided voters is as high as 3 or 4%.
Well, in the battleground states, they are. That's what the opinion polls say.
Okay. But the key thing here is that if they've still been identified in the polls as registered voters and likely voters, chances are they will vote, or if they're not voting, they may have misreported their intentions in the polls. I think at this point they have to make a decision. You know, we've heard anecdotally of voters basically saying, I have to decide right now. I'm on my way to the polls, and they're going to decide at the last minute. And the big question is, which way will they break? Will they break toward Harris, or will they break toward Trump? And the last two presidential elections, the undecided voters broke toward Trump. But this time, if these are new, younger voters, it's hard to tell. And some of them have been affected by particular issues where neither candidate has done well. In particular, the war in Gaza basically is one in which the candidates have taken positions that a lot of young voters don't support. That's a dilemma. If it's the environment and climate, Harris should have the edge there, hands down.
All right. Susan, coming back to you, if I could talk to you about the state of Arizona. The reason I bring it up is because this is a state that has voted Republican for 70 long years, barring just two. One of them was Joe Biden in 2020 when he flipped it to blue. That's one factor. The other factor is that the state is home to one third of Arizona's voters are Latino voters. Now, we know there's so much talk around Latino voters this time. And on top of that, Arizona is a border state, which makes it the first victim of the immigration issue. How should one view Arizona, and how crucial is it?
Yeah, Arizona, of course, is very crucial. Arizona used to not be a swing state. They were pretty solid on which way they would vote. But as you mentioned, Donald Trump has really not only talked about the issue of immigration and border security for a lot of the residents in Arizona. That resonates. And then there's the issue with the Latino voters. I mean, and we talked about this in 2022, and I'm not sure how accurate the polls were. There was a lot of talk about how Latino voters and Hispanic voters are going towards the Republican Party. They are to a certain extent. They did in 2022, but the numbers weren't as high as we thought. Now we're hearing the same, talk of the same issue, and it'll be interesting to see, which way they'll decide to vote. Family values is very important to them, at least the ones that I talk to, and they're a little bit concerned about Kamala Harris's, these are families that they're more conservative, and they sometimes see the Democrat Party leaning more left as opposed to being center. So I think that's one of their concerns. But we'll have to wait and see.
Right. Professor Shapiro, what is your take on the entire political sphere that we are seeing playing out in the United States through the lens of race? Now, I come to you with a few numbers from Pew Research Center, and this was a polling done just a month before the elections. The white voters say that they are 56% with Trump, which is not surprising. They are primarily with Donald Trump. The black voters are 84% with Harris. However, probably the point that we could talk about here is that the black men voters are still saying that they might go with Trump. The Hispanics are 57% with Harris, and Asians 61% with Harris. How do you see all of this fitting in the electoral space?
Well, the inroads that that Trump has made among Latinos and blacks has been reflected in the closeness of the 2016 and 2020 election. The Democrats are winning those groups handily, but the percentages are much less than they used to be. Typically, the Democrats could count on 90% of black votes and around 70% of Hispanic votes. And now if we're talking about 84, 85% of black votes, that's slightly less, but could make a difference in particular states. And the same for Latinos. We're talking about 56% rather than over 60%. And in elections that are decided by small margins, those incremental increases in support that Trump has been able to get can be very significant.
Right. Let me ask you the reason then. The kind of comments we have seen from the Republican camp, and specifically, of course, the nominee Donald Trump, the kind of comments he has made towards the black community as well as the Hispanic community. Why is it that we still see that the two communities, in fact, a larger chunk than the last election, is actually supporting Donald Trump?
Yeah, the thing that you need to keep in mind here is that we've talked about how Trump has an enormous amount of support among working class whites, that is, whites without college degrees. And what's happening now is that he's getting support from similar groups of Latinos and blacks who are basically concerned with economic bread and butter issues and are basically behaving the same way as these white working class voters. And I think that's been making a significant difference. We think of these groups, perhaps more interested in other issues, but really here they're interested in the same kinds of things that white voters are.
All right, Susan, you previously mentioned the gender gap. In fact, one NPR poll says that the gender gap could be the widest in the history of the United States. It puts it as 34%. Back in 2020, if we talk about the same number, it was 23%. In 2016, it was just 14%. So as you were pointing out the gender gap about how the male voters are siding with Donald Trump and the female voters are increasingly going towards Kamala Harris, especially because of the reproductive rights. Could you elaborate a little on that?
Yeah, it doesn't really mean that, women don't vote for Trump or men don't vote for Harris, but it's been significant, at least according to the polls that we're seeing right now. And as you mentioned, I think Kamala Harris and her campaign was really successful in capitalizing on Roe v. Wade, on reproductive rights, on women's rights in general. And I think that has resonated not only with a generation of women who had a lot of concerns regarding women's rights, but also the new generation of women, the younger women as well, who are concerned about these issues, the Dobbs decision. So that's one aspect of it. Another aspect of it is just relatability. That itself, can play a very important factor for the males that vote for Trump and the women that vote for Harris as well. And, I was talking to someone, and he was voting for Trump, and his image of the Trump campaign was that Trump is running a more masculine campaign, being a Trump supporter, he was saying that, for Kamala Harris's campaign, they didn't feel like it was, for just very masculine men, for a lack of a better term. So I thought that was really interesting. I mean, he's just resonated with that kind of voter, and that's why I think at least some of the reasons that we're seeing the gender gap.
All right, Susan, as well as Professor Shapiro, thank you so much for both of you for joining us on this broadcast and getting us your insights. Good to speak to both of you.
Thank you.
For all the latest news, download the WION app and subscribe to our YouTube channel.